mercy and charity with her fine strong sense, and her mild, yet not reproachful gravity, was so well named, and did so well set off and illustrate her sister. What a pleasant sight was that, the contrast they presented, to see each other loved and loving, one sympathizing with and devoted to and leaning on, and yet correcting and counter-checking, as if it were antidoting the other. To behold each damsel in her very admiration of her sister, setting up in business for herself on an entirely different principle, and announcing no connection with over the way, and if the quality of the goods at that establishment don't please you, you are respectfully invited to favour me with a call. And the crowning circumstance of the whole delightful catalogue was, that both the fair creatures were so utterly unconscious of all this. They had no idea of it. They no more thought or dreamed of it than Mr. Pecksniff did. Nature played them off against each other. They had no hand in it, the two Miss Pecksniffs. It has been remarked that Mr. Pecksniff was a moral man. So he was. Perhaps there never was a more moral man than Mr. Pecksniff, especially in his conversation and correspondence. It was once said of him by a homely admirer that he had a Fortunatus's purse of good sentiments in his inside. In this in particular, he was like the girl in the fairy tale, except that if they were not actual diamonds which fell from his lips, they were the very brightest place, and shone prodigiously. He was a most exemplary man, fuller of virtuous precept than a copybook. Some people likened him to a direction post, which is always telling the way to a place and never goes there. But these were his enemies, the shadows cast by his brightness, that was all. His very throat was moral. You saw a good deal of it. He looked over a very low fence of white cravat, whereof no man had ever beheld the tie, being fastened at behind, and there it lay, a valley between two jutting heights of coral, serene and whisperless before him. It seemed to say on the part of Mr. Pecksniff, there is no deception, ladies and gentlemen, all is peace, the holy calm pervades me. So did his hair, just grizzled with the iron grey, which was all brushed off his forehead, and stood bolt upright, or slightly drooped in kindred action with his heavy eyelids. So did his person, which was sleek, though free from corpulency. So did his manner, which was soft and oily. In a word, even his plain black suit and state of widower and dangling double eyeglass all tended to the same purpose, and cried out aloud, "Behold the moral Pecksniff!" The brazen plate upon the door, which being Mr. Pecksniff's could not lie, bore this inscription: "Pecksniff, Architect," to which Mr. Pecksniff on his cards of business added, "and Land Surveyor." In one sense, and only one, he may be said to have been a land surveyor on a pretty large scale, as an extensive prospect lay stretched out before the windows of his house. Of his architectural doings nothing was clearly known, except that he had never designed or built anything, but it was generally understood that his knowledge of the science was almost awful in its profundity. Mr. Pecksniff's professional engagements, indeed, were almost, if not entirely, confined to the reception of pupils, with a collection of rents, with which pursuit he occasionally varied and relieved his graver toils, can hardly be said to be a strictly architectural employment. His genius lay in ensnaring parents and guardians, and pocketing premiums. A young gentleman's premium being paid, and the young gentleman come to Mr. Pecksniff's house, Mr. Pecksniff borrowed his case of mathematical instruments, if silver mounted or otherwise valuable, and treated him from that moment to consider himself one of the family, complimented him highly on his parents or guardians, as the case might be, and turned him loose in a spacious room on the two-pair front, where in the company of certain drawing boards, parallel rulers, very stiff-legged compasses, and two or perhaps three other young gentlemen, he improved himself for 3 or 5 years, according to his articles, in making elevations of Salisbury Cathedral from every possible point of sight, and in constructing in the air a vast quantity of castles, houses of Parliament, and other public buildings. Perhaps in no place in the world were so many gorgeous edifices of this class erected as under Mr. Pecksniff's auspices, and if but 1/20th part of the churches which were built in that front room, with one or other of Miss Pecksniff's at the altar in the act of marrying the architect, could only be made available by the parliamentary commissioners, no more churches would be wanted for at least 5 centuries. Even the worldly goods of which we have just disposed, said Mr. Pecksniff, glancing round the table in the occasion. Even cream, sugar, tea, toast, ham. And eggs, suggested Charity in a low voice. And eggs, said Mr. Pecksniff. Even they have their moral. See how they come and go. Every pleasure is transitory. We can't even eat long. If we indulge in harmless fluids, we get the dropsy. If in an exciting liquids, we get drunk. What a soothing reflection is that! Don't say we get drunk, Pa, urged the eldest Miss Pecksniff. When I say we, my dear, returned her father, I mean mankind in general, the human race, considered as a body and not as individuals. There's nothing personal in morality, my love. Even such a thing as this, said Mr. Pecksniff, laying the forefinger of his left hand upon the brown paper patch on the top of his head. Slight casual baldness though it be, reminds us that we are but, he was going to say worms, but recollecting that worms were not remarkable for heads of hair, he substituted flesh and blood. Which, cried Mr. Pecksniff after a pause, during which he seemed to have been casting round for a new moral, and not quite successfully, which is also very soothing. Mercy, my dear, stir the fire and throw up the cinders. The young lady obeyed, and having done so, resumed her stool. She reposed one arm upon her father's knee, and laid her blooming cheek upon it. Miss Charity drew her chair nearer the fire, as one prepared for conversation, and looked towards her father. Yes, said Mr. Pecksniff after a short pause, during which he had been silently smiling and shaking his head at the fire. I have again been fortunate in the attainment of my object. A new inmate will very shortly come amongst us. A youth, Papa? Asked Charity. Yes, a youth, said Mr. Pecksniff. He will avail himself of the eligible opportunity that now offers for uniting the advantages of the best practical architectural education with the comforts of a home, and the constant association with some who, however humble their sphere and limited their capacity, are not unmindful of their moral responsibility. Oh, Pa, cried Mercy, holding up her finger archly. See advertisement. Playful warbler, said Mr. Pecksniff. It may be observed in connection with his calling his daughter a warbler that she was not at all broken, but that Mr. Pecksniff was in the frequent habit of using any word that occurred to him as having a good sound, and rounding the sentence well without much caring for its meaning. And he did this so boldly, in such an imposing manner, that he would sometimes stagger the wisest people with his eloquence, and make them gasp again. His enemies asserted, by the way, that a strong trustfulness in these sounds and forms was the master key to Mr. Pecksniff's character. Is he handsome, Pa? Inquired the younger daughter. Silly Mary, said the eldest, Mary being fond for Mercy. What is the premium, Pa? Tell us that. Oh, good gracious, Cherry, cried Miss Mercy, holding up her hands with the most winning giggle in the world. What a mercenary girl you are. Oh, you naughty, thoughtful, prudent thing. It was perfectly charming, and worthy of the pastoral age, to see how the two Miss Pecksniffs slapped each other after this, and then subsided into an embrace expressive of their different dispositions. He is well looking, said Mr. Pecksniff slowly and distinctly. Well looking enough. I do not positively expect any immediate premium with him. Notwithstanding their different natures, both Charity and Mercy concurred in opening their eyes uncommonly wide at this announcement, and in looking for the moment as blank as if their thoughts had actually had a direct bearing on the main chance. But what of that, said Mr. Pecksniff, smiling at the fire. There is a disinterestedness in the world, I hope. We are not all arrayed in two opposite ranks, the offensive and the defensive. Some few there are who walk between, who help the needy as they go, and take no part with either side. There was something in these morsels of philanthropy which reassured the sisters. They exchanged glances and brightened very much. Oh, let us not be forever calculating, devising and plotting for the future, said Mr. Pecksniff, smiling more and more, and looking at the fire as a man might who was cracking a joke with it. I am weary of such arts. If our inclinations are but good and open-hearted, let us gratify them boldly, though they bring upon us loss instead of profit. Now, Charity? Glancing towards his daughters for the first time as he had done these reflections, and seeing that they both smiled, Mr. Pecksniff eyed them for an instant so jocosely, but still with a kind of saintly waggishness,